I was born beneath the heat of an Alabama sun that never seemed to forgive the earth. The mulberry plantation stretched beyond sight, a kingdom of rot and gold, where the air carried the scent of iron and sorrow. Even now, after near half a century, I can still feel the dust clinging to my tongue, and the silence of that land pressing against my chest like a confession I never finished speaking. The house itself stood like a mausoleum long before death came to claim it. Every board was soaked through with sweat and prayer, every window shuttered not against light but against memory. My father, a man of thick hands and thin mercy, ruled it like he believed God had spoken his name into the very soil. He said we were blessed, that what grew there grew because of our covenant. But I came to know it was not a blessing. It was a bargain. I was 12 when I first heard whispers of the pact. The elders spoke in fragments in the way the guilty do, not to tell a story, but to keep one buried. They said that long before my birth, when the harvest had failed for 3 years running, the master of Mulberry made an agreement. The details were never written down. Only the results endured. By the next season, the fields grew fat again, and the women in the slave quarters bore more children than the year before. More than seemed possible. I did not understand then what was meant by breeding arrangement. I thought it something of animals, not men. Yet one night, when I wandered too far from the main house, I saw the truth through a broken stable door, a woman weeping as she held a newborn too still to cry. There was another beside her, younger, her belly swollen, her eyes hollowed as if she were already part of the soil. That image followed me into sleep for decades, until sleep itself became a kind of punishment. My father said such things were the Lord's way of multiplying strength. He said mercy was weakness, and God did not favor the weak. I repeated his words, though they tasted like ash. Every Sunday we filled the chapel with hymns so loud they drowned the cries from the quarters. He would bow his head and give thanks for the bounty, and I would look at the cross above him and think of the women who were forced to kneel at its foot, made to believe suffering was salvation. Years later, when the war took the land and the walls began to rot, I walked through those same rooms and saw the stains the rain could not wash away. There were ledgers still stacked in the study, lists of names, births, and numbers written in my father's careful hand, each name marked by a date and a price. I remember tracing my finger over the ink until it blurred, until I could not tell if it was blood or writing. I told myself I would burn them, that the fire might free me from what I'd inherited. But I didn't. I folded the ledger shut and I kept it. I used to hear something in the walls after that. It wasn't voices exactly, it was more like breath. As though the house itself had lungs, and every inhale brought up what it had buried beneath its floors. I would wake at night to the creaking of boards and think it was the sound of the pact remembering me. There was one woman I cannot forget. Her name was Esther. She had a way of looking through people, of seeing what they refused to face. She was the one who told me, with a stillness that felt like judgment, that the soil of Mulberry fed on more than rain, that nothing born of that land would ever be clean. I told her to be silent, not out of cruelty but out of fear. She smiled then faintly, as if she had already forgiven me for what I would become. When she disappeared, no one asked where she'd gone. The ledgers stopped mentioning her name. I searched for her near the old well, by the line of mulberry trees that bent eastward like mourners. The ground there was soft, too soft, and though I could not bring myself to dig, I knew. It was years before I left that place, and longer still before I allowed myself to speak its name aloud. Even now the memory crawls beneath my skin, like the roots that cracked the floorboards of the chapel. I have prayed for forgetting, but God does not grant that mercy to men like me. I can feel the end coming now. My hands tremble as I write this, but the words feel heavier than my bones. I have kept this truth buried longer than the bodies beneath Mulberry's soil. And yet I know the ground remembers. It always remembers. And sometimes I think it still breathes after my father's death. I swore I would never return to Mulberry. But curses, I have learned, do not fade with distance. They wait in the blood. And one morning a letter arrived with the seal of the county clerk, a faded wax crest I hadn't seen in 20 years. It read that the old plantation house had been rediscovered by surveyors. They said it was to be demolished to make way for a new road. They asked if I wished to claim what remained. At first I tore the letter apart. But that night, as the lamps dimmed, I thought I heard her name again, Esther, like a sigh pressed against the glass. I could not sleep. I packed a small bag and left before dawn, driven by something I could not explain. Maybe guilt, maybe duty, maybe the voice of the dead calling me home. The road back to Mulberry was almost gone, devoured by weeds and time. I drove through what was left of the cotton fields, no longer white, just bare stalks twisting in the red dirt like broken bones. The air grew thicker the closer I came, carrying that old metallic smell I once thought was iron from the tools. But it wasn't iron, it was memory. The house stood as I remembered it, leaning, hollow-eyed, half-sunken into the ground. The porch was a rib cage, the windows black sockets. I stood at the threshold for a long time before I dared to enter. Inside the air was still and wet. The wallpaper hung in strips, like skin peeling from something long dead. The chapel was the only room that seemed untouched. The cross still hung above the pulpit, the same one that had once caught the light of 1,000 candles, but now it hung crooked, like it had grown tired of bearing its own weight. Beneath it lay a mound of dust and splintered wood and something else, a book, the ledger. My father's handwriting, faded but unmistakable. I should have burned it then, right there. Instead, I opened it, names, dates, prices, and at the very bottom of the last page, in new ink, not my father's hand, one more entry. My own name. Next to it, a date I did not recognize. My chest tightened. The ink was still wet. That night I stayed in one of the old servant quarters, a mistake I will regret until I die. The floor creaked like breath beneath my bed, and somewhere beyond the walls I heard movement, soft, slow, as though someone were walking through the halls barefoot. I called out, but no one answered. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only the sound of the wind dragging against the shutters. But when I turned back to my room, the ledger was gone. I found it at dawn, lying open on the chapel steps. The last page had changed. Beneath my name, new words had appeared. The debt continues. I remember stumbling backward, unable to breathe. The fields outside seemed to move, the soil pulsing as if stirred from below. A sound like whispering rose through the wind, dozens of voices overlapping, some calling, some crying. My knees gave out, then I saw her, Esther, or what was left of her, standing by the mulberry trees, her dress soaked with soil, her eyes black as the holes in the windows. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I understood. I walked toward her, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground breathing again beneath my feet. When I blinked, she was gone. But where she had stood, the earth had split open, revealing the rim of an old well. I peered inside. The air that rose from it was warm, and it smelled like rust and rain. And in that darkness below I saw movement, shapes that should not move. I ran. I left the house, the trees, everything behind. But when I reached the road, my car was gone. Only the ledger waited on the hood, its cover open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. I don't know what force wrote those words or whose hand guides it now. But I know this. Some debts are written in blood, and blood does not fade. I have come to understand what my father meant when he said we were blessed. He did not mean by God. He meant by something older, something that does not forgive. It rained the third day I stayed at Mulberry, the kind of slow, heavy rain that seeps into the bones of the house and makes the walls weep. I had decided, foolishly, to remain long enough to understand what the ledger wanted from me. Perhaps I believed I could reason with memory, or that the dead might show mercy to a repentant man. But the plantation does not recognize repentance. It only remembers. I took to sleeping in the front room, where I could watch the fields through the cracked shutters. The mulberry trees still stood in perfect lines, their branches bare and twisted like hands reaching upward. Beneath them the soil looked darker than before, richer, almost black. I could not shake the thought that it was not soil at all, but something fed by what we buried there. On the morning of the third day I went back to the chapel. The door was swollen from the rain, and it took some effort to push it open. Inside the pews were warped, their wood splitting at the seams. The cross above the altar had fallen during the night. It lay face down, the head of the figure buried in dust. Behind the pulpit a section of wall had begun to rot through, revealing a cavity between the boards. Inside it, wrapped in brittle cloth, I found a small wooden box. I lifted the lid, a ring. A woman's ring, the gold dull from age. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a page torn from the ledger. The handwriting wasn't my father's, it was hers. "Forgive them not," it said. "They made me their vow." I dropped the paper, my hands trembling. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly sweet, the scent of mulberries rotting in the rain. I knelt, the words echoing in my head. They made me their vow. I remembered my father's sermons, how he used to say that God sealed every promise in blood. He believed the soil could absolve what the soul could not. But he was not speaking of burial. He was speaking of pact, tie of sacrifice. That night I could not bring myself to sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. The trees shifted under the wind, their branches bowing as though in silent prayer. Then I saw her again. Esther. She stood at the edge of the field, unmoving, her white dress faint against the black soil. She lifted her hand, pointing toward the house. I wanted to look away, but my body would not obey. When lightning flashed, she was gone, but her shape remained burned against my sight. I went to the door barefoot, stepping into the mud. The rain was warm, and the air smelled like iron and smoke. Every step toward the trees felt heavier than the last. I reached the well and stared into its dark mouth. The surface rippled, though no drop touched it. When I leaned closer, I saw my reflection, pale, thin, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Then another face appeared beside mine. Not Esther's, my father's. I stumbled back, but his voice followed me, low and deliberate, as if spoken from within the water. "You inherited what you promised," he said. "The soil remembers its covenant." The ground trembled beneath my feet. I turned and ran, slipping in the mud, gasping as the air thickened around me. When I reached the porch, the front door swung open on its own. The ledger sat on the floor inside, open to a new page. There was no ink this time. Just a fingerprint, wet red. I fell to my knees. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that my guilt had taken shape and was feeding on itself. But then I heard it again, the faint rhythm of footsteps above me. Slow, measured. I had boarded the upper floors years ago. No one should have been there. The footsteps stopped directly above the parlor where I sat. Then a soft thud, something small falling to the floor. I hesitated, then forced myself up the stairs. The boards groaned under my weight, and the smell of wet wood grew stronger. When I reached the landing, I saw it, the same wooden box I'd found in the chapel, now sitting neatly in the middle of the hall. The lid was open. Inside was the ring, and beside it a lock of hair, not gold, not brown, but grey my own. I dropped to the floor trembling. The house seemed to breathe around me, the walls pulsing like veins. I realized then what Esther meant. The pact was not only my father's, it was ours. Passed down, renewed in every generation by the one who returned. The house did not need forgiveness. It needed heirs, and I had come home to take my place. I could not leave after that night. I tried, God knows I tried, but the road that led from the mulberry gates was not the same road that brought me there. It forked where it should have been straight, looped where it should have ended. Every turn led me back to the same moss-darkened fence, the same sagging oak whose roots had cracked the cobblestone. By the third attempt I stopped walking. I understood what the land was telling me. I was not meant to go. Inside, the air had grown heavier, as though the house had learned to breathe in my absence. The wallpaper, once pale, now hung loose and mottled with dark blooms of damp. The scent of rot mingled with something faintly metallic, something that reminded me of the day my father bled into the soil after the accident. It was as if the house remembered his blood, still feeding off it after all these years. That night I lit a single candle and sat by the table where the ledger rested. I wanted to burn it. Every line, every signature, every sin carved in ink. But when I tore a page free, the words beneath it shifted, as if written in water. They bled into new shapes, forming names I had never seen. Josephine, Henry, Esther, and then Thomas, my own name, written in my father's hand. I remember sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at the page, tracing the letters with a shaking finger. It was not just a ledger of debt. It was a record of inheritance, a covenant made before I was even born. Each name corresponded to a birth and a death, yet beside mine the date of death was left blank. I went to the window. The rain had stopped, but the air still shimmered with moisture. Out in the field I could see faint movement, small shapes among the trees. I told myself they were branches swaying, but deep down I knew better. The land was restless. I took the ring from the box and held it up to the candlelight. The metal had grown darker, almost blackened. Inside the band was a small engraving I hadn't noticed before. A single word, "Yield I did not sleep." The hours bled into one another until the sky outside began to grey. I must have drifted, because when I opened my eyes, the candle had burned itself down to wax. The ring was gone. At first I thought I had dropped it, but then I saw the trail of wet prints leading from the table toward the back of the house. Small, bare feet pressed into the dust. I followed them through the corridor, past the portraits of my family, whose painted eyes seemed to follow. The trail led to the nursery, a room sealed since I was a boy. The door gave way with a reluctant sigh. Inside the air was colder, still thick with the smell of age and forgotten things. The cradle still sat by the window, its veil of cobwebs stirring faintly. On the floor beside it the ring lay in a pool of moonlight. When I bent to pick it up, the cradle moved. Just slightly, a creak, a sway, nothing more. Yet the motion froze me. There was no wind, nothing to stir it. I backed away, ring in hand, heart pounding. A sound followed, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, like someone singing without words. I recognized the tune. My mother used to hum it when she thought no one was listening. I whispered her name before I realized what I was doing. The humming stopped. Silence swallowed the room whole. Then from the corner something shifted. Fabric, perhaps, or shadow. But when I turned, I saw her portrait, the one that had hung in the parlor, now leaning against the far wall. Someone had carried it here. Her painted eyes had changed. I swear they had. The artist had once captured warmth, but now her gaze was hollow, her mouth drawn in quiet disapproval. The same look she gave my father the night he closed the chapel doors to the workers' quarters. I left the nursery, clutching the ring so tightly it cut into my palm. Blood welled between my fingers. I didn't clean it. I didn't even feel it. Because when I returned to the table downstairs, the ledger was open again, and beside my name a thin red line had appeared, drawn across the blank where my death date should have been. The ink was still wet. I do not remember writing it. Yet the line trembled as though freshly made, and beneath it another word appeared, slow, deliberate, rising like a bruise through the paper. Tonight. I shut the book and threw it to the floor. It landed open on another page, one that bore my father's handwriting again. A sermon draft, maybe, or a confession of his own. Blood binds the living to the soil, he had written. When the line is broken, the ground reclaims what was promised. I knew then what Esther's message had meant. The vow was never between master and servant, nor between husband and wife. It was between the living and the land itself, a pact sealed in generations of birth and death, and my blood, drawn by the ring's edge, had just signed me back into it. I could not bring myself to leave the house that day. The morning came colourless, heavy with mist that clung to the fields like breath on glass. Even the birds seemed to avoid the plantation, their songs fading at its borders, as though the land itself devoured sound. I stood at the window and watched the fog thicken over the mulberry rows until they vanished altogether. It was as if the earth had swallowed its own sins and now struggled to digest them. When I turned from the glass, the room felt smaller. The air was too still, the shadows too alive. Every board beneath my feet moaned like something stirring beneath. I tried to occupy my hands, cleaning, sorting, burning the remnants of what my father left behind. But no matter how I tried to cleanse the place, it remained tainted. The smell of iron lingered in the floorboards, seeping up like old blood that refused to dry. I kept hearing footsteps. Not loud, never loud, just faint measured pacing somewhere above, as if someone were walking the halls in thought. Once I called out, foolish. There was no answer. Only the creak of the beam overhead and the slow, steady thump that could have been my own pulse echoing in my ears. By dusk, I found myself drawn back to the parlour where the portraits hung. My family watched from their frames, the plantation's founders, the so-called pious men of God who baptized their cruelty with scripture. I looked into each painted face and saw a trace of myself. Same jaw, same eyes, same sin. I thought of how many generations had signed that ledger, how many had whispered their vows beneath this roof. That was when I noticed it. Behind my mother's portrait, where the wall met the moulding, a seam of wood stood slightly ajar. The plaster had cracked around it, revealing the edge of something hidden. I pulled at the frame until the nails gave way. Dust filled my throat. Behind it a small door waited, no taller than a child's coffin. I fetched a lamp and crouched before it. The keyhole was filled with wax blackened from age. I dug it out with the end of a spoon, feeling a strange tremor in my hand, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to. When the lock finally gave, the door groaned open. Behind it was a narrow passage, more like a throat carved through the wall. The smell hit first, damp cloth candle soot, and the unmistakable sweetness of decay. The air moved faintly, breathing in and out like something alive. I stepped inside. The space was just wide enough for one man. My shoulders brushed both walls as I moved forward. The floor sloped downward, and the boards grew soft, almost spongy beneath my weight. At the end of the corridor I found a small room, no bigger than a pantry. A cot leaned against the wall, and beside it, a small wooden chest sat open. Inside were scraps of fabric, torn shifts, ribbons, pieces of children's clothing, all rotted with time. Beneath them lay a single rusted chain still bolted into the floor. It was then that I understood what this place had been. Not a storage space, not a prayer room. It was where the pact had been kept alive. The breeding arrangement, as they called it in the ledger, had not been some cold transaction. It was ritual. Each generation forced to renew it in blood and body. I felt my throat close. My father's sermons came back to me, his obsession with purity of line, his endless mutterings about divine order. He had hidden the truth behind God's name. He had given it to the land as an offering. In the corner of the room lay something wrapped in oilcloth. I knelt and unrolled it. Inside was a book bound in cracked leather, older than the ledger, older even than the house. The pages were filled with names and symbols, some drawn in ink, others in a dark brown that could not have been ink. A single page had been marked with a pressed mulberry leaf, now dried and brittle. Written across that page, in a hand that trembled with age, were the words, "The soil remembers the shape of the blood that feeds it." I dropped the book. My skin crawled with a kind of cold that did not come from air. The candle flame beside me wavered and went out, though there was no draught. I backed away until my spine met the wall. The dark was complete, thick, suffocating. I groped my way back through the passage, every breath shallow, until I burst into the parlour again, gasping like a man saved from drowning. I must have stood there for an hour before I realized I still held the mulberry leaf. I stared at it, brittle and blackened, veins still visible, like the map of something once living. My hand shook as I turned it over. On the underside, faint but unmistakable, was writing in the same trembling hand, "You cannot leave what was born here. You are the harvest." I dropped it at once. My fingers felt numb. Outside, the fog had thickened again, pressing itself against the windows. The land was closing in. I could feel it. Every breath I took seemed borrowed. Every sound in that house carried meaning. That night I heard the cradle upstairs again, soft, deliberate creaking, as if something rocked it with care. I stayed in my chair, too afraid to look. When dawn came, I found a single mulberry leaf resting on the table before me, fresh, red-stained. I did not sleep after that. I knew what the land was asking. By the 6th day, the plantation had turned against me. The ground itself seemed to heave underfoot, not with movement, but with memory. The mulberry rows, once straight as soldiers, now grew crooked, their roots clawing at the soil as if reaching for something buried beneath. I could not step outside without feeling watched, not by eyes, but by the very air that hung thick around me. Every breath felt stolen from another century. I began to see him again, my father, not in flesh but in posture. I would glance toward the mirror in the hallway, and see for an instant his shape standing behind me, his shoulders stooped, his hand resting on the very chair he used to beat his sermons into me. The reflection always dissolved before I could turn, but the weight of it lingered, pressing on my spine like an invisible hand, guiding me toward the room behind the wall. I did not return there. Not yet. But its presence followed me. At night, the boards in that part of the house shifted like breath. Sometimes I thought I heard a whisper moving through the walls, not words but rhythm, slow and pulsing, like a heartbeat buried too deep to die. On the 7th evening, a storm broke. The rain did not fall in drops but in sheets, drumming against the shutters with such violence that I thought the house would collapse. I tried to pray, but my voice came out hollow, unconvincing in a sound even I did not believe. The words of the Lord's Prayer stumbled out of me, each syllable dissolving into the roar of the rain. I realized then that I had not prayed for God in years. I had been praying to the silence that replaced him. When the wind subsided, I heard a knock, 3 times deliberate, on the back door. I froze. No one had visited in months. The servants were long gone, the parish empty. Still the knock came again. Same rhythm, same waiting between. I lit a lamp and made my way down the corridor. The house groaned with every step. At the end, I opened the door. There was no one there, only the smell of wet earth. But on the threshold lay something small, a folded scrap of paper sealed with wax. The wax bore no crest, only the impression of a mulberry leaf. I hesitated before touching it. When I finally broke it open, the ink bled as if freshly written. The pact is due. The soil will not sleep forever. No signature, no date. Only that one sentence. I stared into the rain, half expecting to see a figure waiting in the distance, but the fog hid everything. I closed the door, bolted it, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper as if it might breathe. I thought then of what my father had once told me, that our blood was not our own. That the plantation had chosen us long before our birth. He said the land demanded continuity, and every generation was a link in that unholy chain. I had dismissed it as the ravings of a man lost to faith and guilt. Now I was not so sure. Sleep became impossible. The ticking of the grandfather clock grew unbearable. Its pendulum sounded like a beating heart, louder each hour, until I covered it with a blanket. But even then the rhythm continued, slower, heavier, coming now from beneath the floorboards. On the 3rd night of the storm, I went down to the cellar. I had avoided it since I took ownership of the house, for it smelled of mold and something older. The steps groaned like they disapproved of my descent. At the bottom the air was colder, the dampness thicker. My lamp flickered. I could see rows of barrels and broken tools, and in the far corner, what looked like a patch of disturbed earth. I knelt beside it. The soil had been turned recently, soft to the touch. My fingers brushed something smooth beneath, a fragment of porcelain. I dug until I uncovered what it was, a child's doll missing one eye, its fabric body torn open and stuffed with dried mulberry leaves. A sound escaped my throat, not a cry, but something weaker. I dropped the doll and stepped back. Behind me a faint voice echoed, my name spoken in the tone of a man long dead. I turned, but there was nothing, only the darkness breathing against the edges of the lamplight. I stumbled back up the stairs, sealing the door behind me. I knew then that the house was not simply haunted by memory. It was alive with inheritance, feeding on what had been done within its walls. My father had bound us to it, and the land had learned to hunger. That night I dreamed of the fields. The trees stood bare, their limbs twisting like bone. The soil moved beneath them, pulsing, whispering in a voice that sounded like my mother's, "You cannot bury what feeds you." When I awoke, my hands were black with dirt. The lamp had burned out, and on my bedside table, where no one could have placed it, lay the old leather book from behind the wall, open to a page I had not seen before. In the margin, in fresh ink that glistened under the dawn, someone had written, "The harvest comes for its own." I stared at those words until the letters blurred. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but I knew the truth. I was part of that harvest. I always had been. I awoke that morning with the taste of soil still in my mouth. My tongue felt heavy, as if something unspoken lay upon it. The rain had ceased, but the world outside remained grey, swollen with the memory of the storm. I rose and walked to the window. The fields looked altered. The mulberry trees bowed under an unseen weight, their roots exposed like veins crawling through the mud. The ground was no longer still. It seemed to breathe. I should have left. Packed what little I owned and gone south until the land forgot my name. But the thought of leaving felt impossible, like cutting away a part of my own body. The plantation did not allow departures. My father had once said, "A man may leave this earth, but not the soil that raised him." I used to think it was metaphor. Now I understood it was law. By noon I found myself in the study again. The book lay open where I had left it, its ink faintly glistening. But the pages had shifted. New words had appeared, faint at first, then darker, as if written by an invisible hand returning from sleep. When the blood forgets its vow, the roots will remind it. Below the line was a drawing, at it crude yet unmistakable, the outline of a man standing before a tree with 7 branches, each branch ending in a hand instead of leaves. The roots beneath it formed faces, and distorted, crying, familiar. I slammed the book shut. The air thickened, pressing down on me like a wet cloth. Somewhere above, the attic door creaked open. I froze. That door had been nailed shut since the day I moved in. For a long time I stood at the base of the stairs, staring up into the blackness above. The dust swirled in the slant of light, as if disturbed by movement. Finally, with a dread I could no longer resist, I climbed. The attic smelled of old wood and dried herbs. My father's handwriting covered the beams, scripture fragments half erased, rewritten in different hands. In the far corner stood a table, and on it something I could not at first understand, 7 glass jars, each filled with soil. Beneath each jar a strip of parchment bore a name, names I recognized, my brother's, my mother, and one blank strip at the end. My own name was not yet written, but the quill lay ready beside it. I reached out to lift one of the jars. The soil inside pulsed faintly, as if alive. When I touched the glass, I felt warmth, a heartbeat that was not my own. My breath caught. The longer I held it, the more the faint murmur filled my ears. Whispers too soft to form words, but heavy with sorrow. I staggered back and nearly tripped over something on the floor. A chest, small and nailed shut. The wood was stained dark, not with age, but with something deeper. I pried it open using the edge of a broken frame. Inside were relics, locks of hair, buttons, bits of fabric wrapped in twine. Offerings, perhaps sacrifices. Beneath them lay a single folded letter, my father's handwriting again, though shaky and uneven. To the one who remains, do not break the line. The land remembers those who deny it. The harvest is not death, but continuation. The paper slipped from my hands. I understood then what had bound him, and now me to this place. Every generation was not merely heir, but offering. To keep the soil fertile, blood was given, not spilled in violence, but absorbed through presence, through decay, through remembrance. Those who tried to flee found the ground followed them, creeping beneath their feet wherever they went. I ran from the attic, from the house itself, out into the wet fields. The wind tore through the trees like a cry. I fell to my knees in the mud, clawing at the roots of the nearest mulberry. The soil gave way easily, revealing not stones or worms, but fragments of bone. Small, delicate, human. I screamed until my voice cracked. The sound went nowhere. The air swallowed it whole. And then I saw it. In the corner of my vision, a figure standing among the trees. It wore my father's old coat, its head bowed, hands clasped before it. When I called out, it raised its face, and I saw myself staring back. The figure smiled, slow and knowing, before sinking into the ground like smoke drawn downward. The soil closed over it without a sound. I stumbled backward, trembling. My mind told me it was illusion, that grief and guilt were merging into madness. But when I returned to the house, the blank strip in the attic bore a name, mine, written in wet ink. I stared at it until my knees gave way. The realization came cold and final. I was not the heir. I was the next root. The days that followed bled together like ink in water. Time no longer felt like a line I could follow. It folded in on itself, looping through memory and silence. I stopped lighting the lamps. The house had begun to hum softly at night, a low vibration rising through the floorboards, as if the ground beneath was murmuring prayers only the dead could understand. I ate little, slept less. My reflection had grown pale, the eyes darkened with something more than exhaustion. The soil under my nails never washed away completely. Each time I scrubbed my hands, the scent returned, damp, metallic, like the underside of a grave marker. One morning I found footprints in the hallway mud, bare, small, and fresh. They led from my bedroom to the cellar door. I hesitated before opening it, every muscle urging me to walk away, but the quiet down there drew me in, deep and patient. The air grew colder as I descended. The cellar had once been used for storing grain and preserved fruit. Now it reeked of rot and something older, like forgotten earth. My lantern flickered. At the far wall I saw movement, faint, rhythmic, like breathing behind stone. I moved closer. The bricks there had shifted, and through the cracks came a faint pulse of reddish light, as if something alive beat beneath the wall. I pressed my ear against it. A sound came, not words, but something like a lullaby hummed through soil. My mother's voice. I tore at the bricks until my fingers bled. Behind them lay a hollow space, a narrow tunnel lined with roots and cloth scraps that smelled of ash. I crawled inside, the earth closing around me like a throat. The hum grew louder. When I reached the end, I found a chamber, small, round and damp, lit by the faint glow of the jars from the attic, now resting here in the ground. They pulsed in unison, as if breathing together. And in their center, embedded in the soil, was a wooden figure carved crudely in human form. My father's likeness, its eyes painted black. The roots had wrapped themselves around it, growing through its chest and limbs, feeding off it. But something else was bound beside it. A newer carving, smaller, incomplete mine. I fell backward, choking on air. The roots responded, twisting toward me, slow but sure, sensing the tremor of my breath. I scrambled, hands digging into the dirt, but the earth beneath seemed alive, gripping at my wrists, my legs. I clawed and kicked until I broke free, crawling back into the cellar, gasping as the tunnel closed behind me like a wound sealing shut. When I turned, The jars were gone. Only the faint sound of soil shifting remained. I stumbled upstairs, dizzy with dread. In the parlor, the book still lay open, though I was certain I had thrown it into the fire days ago. The pages had changed again. Now there was only one line, written in thick, wet ink that glistened as if still drying. The last root must be buried by its own hand. The wind outside rose suddenly, shaking the windows. A whisper threaded through the house, my name spoken over and over, each voice blending into another until it became a single, endless tone. I could feel it vibrating in my bones, drawing me toward the door. Outside, the night had no stars. The fields stretched endlessly into darkness, their shapes wrong as if the land itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. I walked without meaning to, the ground guiding me toward the old oak near the edge of the property. At its base lay a freshly dug hole. The shovel stood upright beside it. My hands moved without thought, gripping the handle, feeling the smoothness of wood worn by generations. I looked down into the pit. It was shallow but large enough to hold a man. I dropped the shovel. My chest heaved. For a moment I thought I could still escape, walk away, burn the house, salt the fields. But the soil beneath my boots trembled. I heard the heartbeat again, slow, heavy, patient. The earth was waiting. Then I saw the footprints around the hole, my own circling it again and again as though I had been here before, perhaps many times. A memory flickered, me digging under the same tree, the same cold wind, the same dread crawling up my spine. I fell to my knees, staring into the pit, and realized the truth. This was not the first burial. It was only the next. The family line had never ended. It simply folded back into itself. Each generation fed the soil which fed the next, until none of us could tell where blood ended and earth began. As I knelt there, the rain began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, drumming against the ground in rhythm with my pulse. And with each drop, the soil beside me began to move, shifting, parting, as if making room for one more. By the time the rain stopped, I was no longer sure if I had dreamt the night beneath the oak or lived it. My hands were streaked with dirt, my boots sunk deep in wet soil, and the air smelled of something raw and unclean, like turned graves after a storm. When I stumbled back to the house, dawn was crawling through the mist, but the light did not comfort me. It only revealed what had changed. The windows had fogged from the inside. Every surface glistened with moisture, as though the house itself had begun to sweat. The wallpaper near the staircase had peeled away entirely, revealing words scrawled beneath the plaster, prayers, names, and phrases I recognized from the book. I had never written them, and yet the penmanship was mine. On the dining table lay the book again. The cover was swollen, the spine warped from dampness. But when I opened it, I found no words, only pressed leaves, each one etched with faint veins that formed faces. Some were of people I remembered from the plantation, overseers, workers, even my mother. Others were unknown. But one leaf, the smallest and palest, bore the faint outline of a child's face. I closed the book and sat there for what might have been hours. My mind wandered through the years I had tried to forget, the nights when the cries from the fields never stopped, when the earth itself seemed to moan under the weight of what we buried. We told ourselves it was mercy, that it was order. But every generation who spoke that lie had sown a seed they would later dig up themselves. The silence broke when I heard a sound, soft, like footsteps dragging across the upstairs floor. I froze, waiting. Then it came again, followed by the slow creak of my father's old door. That room had been sealed since his death. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered. When I reached his door, I found it half open. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and candle smoke. His bed stood untouched, the sheets still folded neatly. But on the pillow rested a small wooden carving, the same figure I had seen in the underground chamber. Only now the eyes were no longer black. They were hollow, gouged clean. I picked it up and felt warmth where none should be. Beneath it lay a folded note in my father's handwriting. "You cannot bury what was born from the pact. It will always find its hand." A shadow shifted near the window. I turned and nothing, only the curtain moving in the breeze. But when I looked down, I saw footprints in the dust, smaller than mine, bare, leading toward the hallway. I followed them past the broken mirror, past the empty nursery, until they stopped at the door of my old room. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The latch was already open. Inside, the air was cold. My childhood bed stood in the corner, the quilt rotted to threads. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust, sat a small glass jar, the same kind I had found in the attic weeks ago. Inside it, something pale floated, a withered root coiled tightly, pulsing faintly as if still alive. I held it to the light. For a heartbeat, I saw something move inside the glass, a flicker like an eye opening. I dropped it. The jar shattered, spilling dark water across the floor. The root writhed once, then stilled, but in that moment, the walls seemed to breathe again, and I heard a voice, faint from below, calling my name the way my mother used to. I staggered backward, heart hammering, and fled the room. The house felt alive now, shifting with each breath I took. The doors creaked, the floor buckled, and somewhere deep below the hum of the earth began again. I stumbled into the parlor. The curtains moved, though there was no wind. My reflection in the mirror looked wrong. Younger, then older, then something in between. My lips moved before I could stop them, whispering a prayer I hadn't spoken since boyhood. But no sound came out. Then a knock, slow, heavy, coming from beneath the floor. 3 times. Then silence. My knees gave out. I pressed my ear to the floorboards. A faint rhythm pulsed beneath, like a heartbeat. Not of one man, but many. I could hear whispers, too, rising through the wood like smoke through cracks. Words I almost recognized. Names, please. And among them a single voice that sounded like my own, only younger. Steady, unbroken by age. It whispered the words I had tried to forget all these years. The vow made beneath the mulberry tree, before the overseer, before the priest who had no scripture left in him. The pact that tied our blood to the soil, ensuring that no labor would be lost, no sin would ever leave the land. I crawled away, trembling, but the voice followed me, from the walls, the floor, the air. Each word repeated until it became a pulse in my skull. The land remembers its debt. I covered my ears. The sound grew louder, until I could no longer tell if it was outside or within me. The walls shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. The ground below began to stir once more, that same soft movement, as though the soil were breathing through the cracks in the foundation. And then, from deep beneath the house, I heard the unmistakable scrape of something wooden being dragged across stone, slow, deliberate, like a coffin being pulled toward the surface. I whispered to no one, "It isn't finished, is it?" The house answered with silence. But beneath it, I could still hear that slow, faithful scraping, us moving closer. It has taken me half a lifetime to find the courage to write these words, though I suppose courage no longer matters to a man who wakes each night to the echo of the same sound. The dragging beneath the house has not stopped. It never does. It only grows softer, slower, as if whatever stirs below no longer seeks to rise, but to remind me that it still remembers my name. I have not stepped beyond the porch in 7 years. The fields lie empty now, overtaken by weeds tall as my shoulders. The mulberry tree still stands, though its trunk is split and hollow. I see crows nesting in it each spring, their cries sounding like laughter at a sermon long forgotten. The house has become my confessional, each wall a listener, each floorboard a witness to what I can no longer deny. When I sleep, I see the pact as it was. The night of it, the faces gathered under the torchlight, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and blood. We were told it was mercy, that such an arrangement would preserve the land, the bloodlines, the order. But what we made was not mercy. It was hunger, and it ate everything that touched it. There were 7 of us who signed. Only I remain. The others died strange deaths, One drowned in his own well, another hanged himself in his smokehouse, and one was found half buried near the riverbank, as if the earth itself had tried to reclaim him. I buried them all with my own hands. I thought that would end it. It did not. I hear them sometimes, and not as ghosts, but as voices carried through the soil. They speak in the rhythm of rain on the roof, in the sighs of the wind between the rafters. When I close my eyes, I can almost understand what they're saying. It's not accusation, it's repetition. The same vow we swore that night, whispered over and over until it becomes the only truth left in this place. The book still lies on my table, its pages now as brittle as ash. I tried burning it once, but the flame would not take. It only smouldered, releasing a smell like wet clay. So I left it there beside the window, where the light of morning can fall upon it. Sometimes I see it open on its own. The pages flutter though there is no breeze, and I glimpse words I did not write. Heir of the land, keeper of debt. I have no children. Yet each morning I find small handprints on the windowsill, pressed faintly into the dust. Too small to be my own. I stopped wiping them away. It feels wrong to pretend they aren't real. Yesterday I walked again to the tree. My legs shook the entire way, and the cane sank deep into the mud with each step. The ground beneath was soft, freshly turned, though no one has tilled it for decades. I reached the base of the tree and found something I had not seen since that night. The old wooden box, the one that held the pact itself, half buried but unbroken. The lock was gone, the lid ajar. Inside, the paper still rested there, yellowed and flaking, but the ink had spread like veins across the fibers. I could still read one line clearly, bound by soil, blood and name, until the last hand of the pact falls still. I pressed my hand against the paper. For the first time I felt warmth in my fingers, a pulse that wasn't my own. I knew then that I would not die as the others did. My punishment was to remain, not as a warning but as a remembrance, to bear the weight of silence long enough that the land could breathe again. The sun dipped behind the trees as I walked back. I could hear the river beyond the fields, the same river that once carried the cries of the ones we buried without markers. Its current has changed course over the years, now winding closer to the house. Each night the water hums softly beneath the floorboards, as though the earth itself is trying to wash something away. I am writing this now, by candlelight. The flame trembles, though there is no draught. I think of her, the woman whose eyes met mine that night under the mulberry tree, before we sealed the pact with words neither of us believed. She was the first to be chosen. I never learned what became of her, though I have dreamt of her face every night since. She does not accuse me. She only watches, waiting. The candle is almost gone. The house feels quiet in a way it hasn't for years. Even the scraping has stopped. I can hear my breath, and beneath it something else, a heartbeat faint and steady coming from the earth itself. I think it's been there all along. Perhaps it is the land's own heart, waiting for mine to cease so it may finally rest. If anyone finds this, burn what remains of this place. Let no stone or root survive. Do not come here seeking truth or forgiveness. There is neither, only soil that remembers, and names that should never have been spoken aloud. I will leave the book open on the table, the candle beside it. When the flame dies, perhaps the land will close its eyes once more, and when it does, maybe, just maybe, the silence will finally be clean.